The transport shuttle shook as it entered the atmosphere of Kepler Prime. Lisa Martinez gripped her seat and watched through the small window as alien buildings grew larger below them. She had never seen anything like this place. The structures twisted upward in impossible spirals and glowed with soft blue light. Flying vehicles moved between them in perfect patterns like a dance. She did not understand. Lisa was 24 years old and had spent the last 6 years fighting monsters in the ruins of Australia. Now she was heading to the most famous military school in the galaxy. Only 12 humans had been chosen for this program out of billions who applied. She still could not believe they had picked her. The shuttle landed with a soft bump on a platform that seemed to be made of some kind of living crystal. Lisa grabbed her single bag and followed the other passengers out into the bright alien sunlight. The air smelled different here, cleaner than anything she remembered from Earth. Even the sky was wrong, showing 2 small suns instead of 1. Other new students were already gathering on the platform. Lisa saw beings she had only read about in the files they gave her during the trip. There were tall gray creatures with extra arms, small furry things that walked on 4 legs, and something that looked like it was made entirely of blue crystal. They all stared at her as she walked past. A human man about her age waved at her from near a group of floating cargo containers. "You must be the other human," he said with a grin. "I'm Jake Harrison from New York. Well, what's left of New York." Anyway, Lisa shook his hand. Lisa Martinez. Detroit before it got completely overrun. She was glad to see another human face. Jake looked like he had been through some tough times, too. There were scars on his arms that she recognized from fighting the bioengineered creatures that had escaped containment after the war. "So we're really doing this," Jake said as they watched alien students sorting through their belongings with tentacles and claws and things Lisa had no names for. Training alongside species that have been flying between stars since before humans invented the wheel. A loud sound echoed across the platform. All the students stopped what they were doing and turned toward a massive building that rose from the center of the academy grounds. Lisa could see figures moving on balconies high above them. "New recruits report to orientation hall immediately," said a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The translation device they had implanted behind Lisa's ear turned the alien words into English that sounded flat and mechanical. Jake and Lisa followed the crowd of students into the building. The hallways were huge and decorated with symbols from dozens of different worlds. Lisa saw battle flags and weapon displays, and statues of famous warriors from across the galaxy. None of them looked human. The orientation hall was big enough to hold 1,000 people. Lisa and Jake found seats near the back and watched as students from 40 different species filled the room. Some flew to their seats, others crawled along the walls, and a few seemed to phase in and out of existence. A figure stepped onto the stage at the front of the hall. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The being was nearly 3 meters tall with 4 arms and skin that looked like black armor. Its head was elongated and covered in spines, and when it opened its mouth she could see rows of sharp teeth. "I am Instructor Zexthel Vorthik of the Veltar Hegemony," the creature said. Its voice was deep and filled with clicking sounds that the translator turned into perfect English. "I have trained over 500 graduates of this academy. Many of them now command fleets and govern star systems." Zexthel walked across the stage with movements that reminded Lisa of a predator stalking prey. "You are here because your species believes you have potential. Some of you will prove this belief correct. Most will not." The instructor's 4 eyes swept across the assembled students. When his gaze fell on Lisa, she felt like he was looking right through her to catalog every weakness and failure. "We will begin with introductions," Zexthel announced. "Each student will state their name, homeworld, and relevant experience. One by one the students stood and spoke. Lisa heard about training programs that lasted decades, military traditions going back thousands of years, and technologies she could barely understand. The Veltar student had been bred specifically for warfare and trained since birth. The crystalline being could manipulate matter at the molecular level. A floating jellyfish-like creature claimed to have photographic Memory of every battle fought in its sector for the past century. Finally, it was Lisa's turn. She stood on shaking legs and felt every eye in the room focus on her. Lisa Martinez from Earth. I served 6 years in the Australian Marine Corps fighting escaped bioweapons. Zexthel pulled out a datapad and scrolled through information for several long seconds. His mandibles clicked together in a sound that made several students near Lisa move away from her. Earth, he said slowly. Classification level 12 Deathworld. One of only 7 planets in known space to receive such a designation. He looked up from his pad directly at Lisa. Your species has barely achieved interstellar flight. You wage war with primitive projectile weapons and chemical explosives. More clicking sounds came from Zexthel's mouth. Lisa realized he was laughing at her. Most concerning, your species actively seeks conflict rather than avoiding it as any rational being would do. The other students began making sounds that the translator turned into various forms of amusement. Lisa felt heat rise in her cheeks but forced herself to remain standing. Your homeworld, Zexthel continued, is a barely habitable nightmare of extreme weather, predatory wildlife, and geological instability. Most species would consider it uninhabitable even with advanced technology. Jake started to stand up, but Lisa caught his arm and shook her head. She could handle this herself. While this makes humans physically resilient, the instructor went on, it also makes them psychologically unstable and tactically primitive. Your people have been killing each other with increasingly sophisticated weapons for your entire recorded history. Zexthel turned to address the rest of the class. This is why the Galactic Council was hesitant to allow human participation in this program. Deathworld species tend to view violence as a first option rather than a last resort. Lisa sat down as the instructor moved on to the next student. She could feel alien eyes on her from every direction. Some looked curious, others seemed afraid, but most just looked like they thought she did not belong here. The orientation continued for 2 more hours. Zexthel explained the Academy's history, its training methods, and its expectations for students. Everything was designed around the idea that civilized warfare was conducted through careful planning, advanced technology, and minimal direct confrontation. Proper military strategy, he said, involves economic manipulation, technological superiority, and psychological operations. Direct physical confrontation is the domain of lesser species who lack the intelligence for sophisticated tactics. When the session ended, students began filing out of the hall in small groups organized by species. Lisa and Jake found themselves walking alone toward the dormitory complex. Well, that was encouraging, Jake said sarcastically. Lisa looked back at the orientation hall where she could still see Zexthel talking with other instructors. He's never actually been in a real fight, she said quietly. What do you mean? The way he talks about violence, about conflict. It's all theoretical to him, like something he's read about in books but never experienced. Lisa thought about the creatures she had fought in the ruins of Sydney, things that killed for the simple joy of killing. He has no idea what real violence looks like. They found their rooms in a dormitory designed for average galactic physiology. Lisa's quarters were too small, the bed was too short, and the air recycling system made strange noises. But it was clean and private, and it was hers. She sat on the narrow bed and looked out the window at the alien landscape beyond the Academy grounds. Strange plants moved in patterns that suggested intelligence, and flying creatures that might have been animals or machines or something in between filled the sky. Lisa had come here to represent her species, to prove that humans belonged among the stars. But sitting in this alien room surrounded by beings with millennia of technological advancement, she wondered if Zexthel might be right. Maybe humans really were just violent primitives who had stumbled into space by accident. She pulled out the photo she always carried, showing her unit after they had cleared the bioweapon nest in Perth, 12 Marines who had walked into hell and come out alive. 3 of them had not made it home from the next mission. Lisa looked at their faces and made a promise. She would not let Zexthel or anyone else dismiss what they had sacrificed. Humans might be primitive by galactic standards, but they knew how to fight and they knew how to win. She would find a way to prove that being from a Deathworld was not a weakness. It was a strength. 3 weeks had passed since Lisa arrived at the academy, and every day felt like a test designed for her to fail. The training schedules were built around alien biology and psychology that made perfect sense to everyone except humans. Where other species excelled at long-range combat with energy weapons and group coordination, Lisa found herself struggling with equipment that felt wrong in her hands, and tactics that ignored every instinct she had developed over 6 years of real combat. The morning combat simulation began like all the others. Lisa stood in the preparation chamber wearing armor designed for beings with different proportions and muscle distribution. The helmet was too large and shifted when she moved. Quickly, the energy rifle felt unbalanced compared to the kinetic weapons she had trained with on Earth. Even the targeting system seemed to anticipate movements that human eyes and reflexes did not naturally make. Today's scenario involves neutralizing hostile forces in an urban environment, announced Zexthel from the observation platform above the training chamber. Standard doctrine requires careful assessment of civilian populations, infrastructure preservation, and minimal collateral damage. Lisa activated her equipment and studied the holographic city that materialized around her. The buildings were tall and fragile-looking, connected by bridges and platforms that would collapse if hit by anything heavier than small arms fire. Simulated civilians moved through the streets in predictable patterns, while enemy forces established positions in key defensive locations. Her fellow students began their assault using textbook formations. The Veltar student advanced with 3 different weapon systems providing overlapping fields of fire. The crystalline being used molecular manipulation to create cover while maintaining sight lines for precision shots. Every movement was calculated and efficient according to galactic military doctrine. Lisa watched their careful advance and felt frustration building in her chest. The enemy positions were obvious and the civilian patterns were clearly programmed rather than random. In the ruins of Australia, she had learned to trust her instincts about where threats would come from and how to end fights quickly before they could escalate. Here, everything was about following procedures that took forever and gave the enemy time to adapt. She broke from the assigned formation and moved toward a side street that her fellow students had ignored. The tactical display showed it as unimportant because it did not provide direct access to the primary objectives. But Lisa had noticed that the enemy patrol patterns left it unguarded for 30-second intervals. Martinez, return to your assigned position. Zexthel's voice echoed through her helmet communicator. Lisa ignored the order and slipped through the gap in enemy coverage. She moved quickly through buildings rather than exposed streets, using doorways and windows that the simulation designers had probably included for decoration rather than tactical use. Within minutes, she had flanked the main enemy position and could see clear shots at targets that were completely focused on her. Classmates' frontal assault. She opened fire and eliminated 3 enemy units before they realized they were being attacked from an unexpected direction. The simulation's AI immediately adapted by sending reinforcements to her position, but Lisa was already moving to a new location. She had learned in real combat that staying in one place after shooting was a good way to die quickly. The exercise ended with all primary objectives completed in half the expected time. Lisa's unconventional approach had drawn enemy attention away from her classmates and allowed them to advance without the usual tactical complications. It should have been considered a successful operation. Instead, Zexthel's mandibles were clicking rapidly as he reviewed the tactical recordings. Martinez, explain your reasoning for abandoning the assigned plan. Lisa removed her helmet and looked up at the observation platform. The plan was too slow, sir. The enemy had time to reinforce their positions and coordinate their response. My approach disrupted their timing and created opportunities for the primary assault. Your approach violated 3 different articles of the Galactic Combat Conventions, Zexthel replied. You moved through civilian areas without proper clearance protocols. You engaged targets without confirming identity through proper channels. Most seriously, you prioritized speed over safety in a way that could have resulted in massive collateral damage. The other students gathered around to hear Zexthel's analysis of what had gone wrong. Lisa noticed that several of them moved slightly away from her, as if her tactical thinking might be contagious. This is exactly why Deathworld species require extensive retraining before they can participate in civilized warfare. The instructor continued. Humans think like predators rather than soldiers. They prioritize immediate results over long-term strategic considerations. Lisa felt something hot and angry building in her stomach. Sir, my approach worked. The mission was completed with 0 friendly casualties and minimal enemy resistance. Your approach worked through luck rather than skill, Zextel said dismissively. Against a more sophisticated enemy, your reckless tactics would have resulted in disaster. This is why advanced species have developed proper military doctrine over thousands of years of experience. After the simulation ended, Lisa found herself walking alone to the next training session. Her fellow students had formed their usual species-based groups, and none of them seemed interested in including the unpredictable human in their conversations. Even Jake was busy working with equipment designed for their physiology and had not noticed her. Isolation. The afternoon brought tactical theory classes where Zextel lectured about proper civilized warfare. He described conflicts between galactic powers that lasted decades and were resolved through economic pressure and technological superiority rather than direct confrontation. Battles were fought by remote-controlled systems across vast distances with minimal risk to actual personnel. Advanced species understand that war is ultimately about resource allocation and strategic positioning, he explained to the class. Physical combat should be avoided whenever possible because it represents a failure of proper planning and negotiation. Lisa listened to descriptions of wars where victory was measured in market share and technological patents rather than territory held or enemies defeated. She thought about the bioweapon creatures that had overrun half of Australia, things that could not be negotiated with or economically pressured into surrender. They had to be found and killed one by one in close-quarters combat because that was the only language they understood. The breaking point came during the next day's hostage rescue simulation. The scenario involved extracting civilians from a space station that had been captured by pirates. Standard galactic doctrine called for careful reconnaissance, extended negotiation attempts, and finally a precisely coordinated assault that minimized damage to the station's valuable infrastructure. Lisa studied the tactical display and saw a different solution. The pirates were using the station's life support system as leverage, threatening to kill the hostages if their demands were not met. But the station's design included emergency, safe rooms where the civilians could survive even if the main life support failed. She proposed creating a controlled breach in the station's hull that would force the pirates to retreat to escape pods, while leaving the hostages protected in the safe rooms. The plan would end the crisis quickly with minimal risk to innocent lives. Zextel's reaction was immediate and harsh. This suggestion demonstrates exactly why primitive species should not be trusted with modern warfare, he announced to the entire class. Martinez is proposing what amounts to a terrorist attack on civilian infrastructure. He turned to face the other students as if Lisa was an exhibit in a museum of military failures. Notice how the Deathworld mind immediately turns to destruction and violence rather than sophisticated solutions. This is typical primitive thinking that prioritizes immediate action over careful consideration. But sir, Lisa said, trying to keep her voice level, my plan would save the hostages and end the threat in minutes rather than hours. The pirates would be forced to abandon their position without being able to harm anyone. Your plan would cause massive property damage, psychological trauma to survivors, and set a precedent that encouraged similar attacks in the future, Zextel replied. These are consequences that a more evolved mind would consider automatically. Lisa felt the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest, but this time it was mixed with something colder and more dangerous. She had spent weeks trying to adapt to alien methods and prove that humans could think like civilized beings. But Zextel was not interested in her adaptation. He wanted her to fail so he could use her as an example of human inadequacy. Permission to speak freely, sir, she said quietly. Zexthal's mandibles clicked in amusement. Granted. You have never been in a real fight in your life, Lisa said, looking directly into his compound eyes. Everything you know about combat comes from theory and simulations. You study war like it's an academic exercise because your species has never faced anything that actually wanted to kill you. The classroom went completely silent. Several students made sounds that indicated shock or fear. Even Jake was staring at her with wide eyes. Lisa spent 3 days in detention, sitting alone in a small room with nothing but basic rations and time to think about what she had done. The walls were plain metal, and the only sound was the hum of air recyclers that reminded her constantly that she was trapped inside an alien space station far from home. She had probably destroyed any chance of completing the program, but she found that she did not regret confronting Zextal about his ignorance of real combat. On the 4th morning, Jake appeared at her door with news that changed everything. You need to hear this, he said as soon as the guards allowed him inside. Admiral Velasquez is coming to visit the academy next week. Lisa knew that name from the briefings they had received before leaving Earth. Admiral Corth Velasquez of the Centauri Defense Force was one of the most respected military leaders in the galaxy. She had commanded fleets in 3 major conflicts and was considered a genius of strategic planning. For students at the academy, meeting her was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. There's going to be a special competition, Jake continued. Advanced tactical exercise with real-world scenarios. The winning team gets direct placement in the Admiral's personal staff program. Lisa felt a spark of interest for the first time since her confrontation with Zextal. What kind of exercise? Full-scale military operation simulation. They're using the scenario from the Kepler asteroid crisis that happened 5 years ago. Terrorist cell takes control of a mining asteroid and threatens to crash it into a populated moon. Multiple civilian populations at risk, limited time window, and the terrorists have military-grade equipment. Jake pulled up the scenario details on his portable datapad. The asteroid was massive, heavily defended, and on a collision course. That would kill millions of people if not stopped. Traditional approaches would require either lengthy negotiations that might fail, precise long-range bombardment that risked fragmenting the asteroid into multiple threats, or complex boarding. Operations that could take too long to execute. Teams are forming along species lines like always, Jake said. The Veltar students are working with the crystalline beings. The energy creatures have partnered with those floating jellyfish things. Everyone expects one of those combinations to win because they have the most advanced tactical thinking. Lisa looked at the scenario data and felt something click into place in her mind. She had been trying to fight like an alien for weeks, using their methods and their equipment and their rules, but this was different. This was a real problem that needed a real solution, not a classroom exercise designed to test theoretical knowledge. What about us? She asked. Jake shifted uncomfortably. Well, we're just the 2 humans. Most of the other teams have 4 to 6 members with different specializations. And after what happened with Zextal, I'm not sure anyone wants to work with us anyway. Lisa studied the asteroid's specifications more carefully. Its rotation period, defensive systems, internal layout, and proximity to the threatened moon created a narrow window for action. The terrorist cell consisted of 12 augmented mercenaries with combat experience and access to weapons that could penetrate most known armor types. We don't need a big team, she said slowly. We need to do something that no one expects. Over the next 3 days, Lisa and Jake worked on their plan in secret. They studied the Academy's available equipment, analyzed the asteroid's structural weak points, and developed an approach that would have horrified their instructors if they had known about it. Lisa requisitioned a training shuttle using Jake's authorization codes and spent hours modifying its systems in ways that definitely violated Academy regulations. She removed everything non-essential to reduce the shuttle's mass and weight. Life support was stripped down to bare minimums. Passenger comfort systems were completely eliminated, and even some safety features were disabled to improve performance. What remained was essentially a guided missile with just enough life support to keep 2 people alive for a short mission. Jake watched her work with growing alarm. Lisa, this thing is going to be a death trap if anything goes wrong. No backup systems, no emergency protocols, no margin for error? That's exactly why it will work, Lisa replied as she installed additional inertial dampeners scavenged from other shuttles. No rational species would attempt what we're planning because the risk of failure is too high. But high risk means they won't be prepared for it. The night before the competition, Zexthel visited Lisa in her quarters. She had not spoken to him since her outburst in class and was surprised to see him standing in her doorway looking almost uncomfortable. I have reviewed your preliminary plan submission, he said without his usual arrogance. I am here to offer you an opportunity to withdraw from the competition gracefully. Lisa gestured for him to enter, and they sat facing each other across the small table that served as both desk and dining area. Up close, she could see that Zexthel's compound eyes showed signs of fatigue that his species experienced under stress. Your approach is mathematically unsound, he continued. The probability of success is less than 15% even under optimal conditions. Failure in front of Admiral Velasquez could end your military career permanently. What's the success probability for the other teams? Lisa asked. Zexthel's mandibles clicked softly. The Veltar Crystalline Alliance has approximately 60% chance of success using standard infiltration protocols. The Energy Creature Coalition estimates 70% success with their technological solutions. Lisa nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. And what happens if all the standard approaches fail? What's the backup plan when sophisticated tactics don't work? There would be alternative options considered, Zexthel said carefully. Like ramming the asteroid with a heavy cruiser to knock it off course? That would probably work, but it would also kill everyone on board the ship used for the ramming. Lisa leaned back in her chair. My plan has the same basic result with a much smaller sacrifice. Zexthel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his tone was almost gentle. Your species has potential, Martinez. Humans excel at individual combat and survival in hostile environments. But this exercise requires sophisticated coordination and advanced planning. Let me reassign you to a support role with one of the other teams. Lisa met his compound eyes steadily. With respect, sir, I think you are about to learn something new about human capabilities. The instructor's spines bristled slightly, but he controlled his reaction. Very well, but remember that. I offered you a graceful exit from this situation. After he left, Lisa finished her final preparations. She checked and rechecked every system on the modified shuttle, reviewed the asteroid's structural data one more time, and made sure that her equipment was properly secured for the kind of forces they were about to experience. Jake found her in the shuttle bay at midnight, running diagnostics on their improvised weapon system. You know, this is completely insane, he said. Completely, Lisa agreed. That's why it's going to work. She sealed the shuttle's access hatch and activated the pre-flight checklist. Tomorrow she would either prove that humans deserved respect as warriors, or she would fail spectacularly in front of the most important military leader in the galaxy. Either way, the galaxy was about to see what a Deathworld human could really do when pushed beyond her limits. The competition would begin in 8 hours. Lisa spent the remaining time in meditation, focusing her mind the way her instructors in Australia had taught her before dangerous missions. She thought about the Marines who had died fighting bioweapon creatures, about the people depending on her to represent humanity properly, and about Zexthel's certainty that humans were too primitive for civilized warfare. Tomorrow she would show them all that being primitive was not the same as being weak. Sometimes the universe needed someone willing to take risks that rational beings would never consider. Sometimes it needed someone from a death world who understood that survival meant doing whatever was necessary to win. Lisa closed her eyes and prepared for battle. The Academy's main auditorium buzzed with excitement as Admiral Velasquez arrived with her security detail and staff officers. Lisa watched from the competitors section as the most powerful military leader in known space took her seat at the observation platform. The admiral was tall for an Altarian, with silver skin that reflected the room's lights and the bearing of someone who had commanded fleets in battles that shaped galactic history. Instructor Zexthal stood at attention beside the admiral's chair while other academy officials arranged themselves in order of importance. Lisa could see the tension in his posture and wondered if he was having second thoughts about allowing her to participate in front of such an important audience. The first team to present their plan was the Veltar Crystalline Alliance. Their leader, a being named Korthval, who had been bred specifically for tactical planning, activated a holographic display that showed their proposed infiltration strategy. They would use cloaked ships to approach the asteroid undetected, deploy neural disruptors to disable the terrorist defenders, and then carefully extract the civilians while preventing any damage to the mining infrastructure. Admiral Velasquez listened without expression as Korthval explained how their approach would minimize casualties and preserve valuable resources. The plan was sophisticated, well-researched, and based on proven tactics that had worked in similar situations. When the presentation ended, several audience members made appreciative sounds. The Energy Creature Coalition went next with a technological solution that involved quantum tunneling devices and precision molecular disassembly tools. They could theoretically dismantle the terrorist weapons while leaving the defenders unharmed, then use gravity manipulation to redirect the asteroid away from the populated moon. Their presentation included complex mathematical proofs and energy calculations that impressed even the Academy. Instructors. Team after team presented plans that demonstrated thousands of years of military evolution and scientific advancement. Each approach was carefully reasoned, thoroughly tested through simulation, and designed to achieve victory with minimal risk and maximum efficiency. Finally, it was Lisa's turn. She stood before the assembled officials, military leaders, and fellow students, feeling very small and very human among all the advanced alien intelligences. Jake gave her an encouraging nod from the competitor section, but she could see the worry in his eyes. Admiral Velasquez, instructors, fellow students, Lisa began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's acoustic systems. Our plan is simple. We are going to ram the asteroid with our shuttle and fight the terrorists in hand-to-hand combat. The silence that followed was so complete that Lisa could hear the hum of the building's power systems. She looked out at faces and sensory organs and energy patterns that all conveyed the same basic emotion. Disbelief. Several students began making sounds that the translation systems rendered as various forms of laughter or amazement. A few of the more nervous species moved away from her as if her tactical thinking might be contagious. Even some of the instructors were clicking or buzzing or whistling in what Lisa had learned to recognize as expressions of shock. Admiral Velasquez raised one silver hand and the auditorium immediately fell silent. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Explain your reasoning. Lisa activated her own holographic display showing the asteroid's structure and defensive positions. The terrorists expect sophisticated approaches because that is how civilized species conduct warfare. They have prepared for siege tactics, negotiation attempts, and complex boarding operations. They have not prepared for someone to crash through their defenses and engage them in primitive close-quarters combat. She highlighted the asteroid's weakest structural points and showed how a high-speed impact at the right angle would create massive internal damage while avoiding the heavily defended docking bays and access ports that other teams plan to use. The psychological impact alone will be devastating, Lisa continued. These mercenaries are used to fighting opponents who follow galactic combat conventions. They have never faced someone who views physical confrontation as an advantage rather than the last resort. Admiral Velasquez studied the tactical projections with the intense focus that had made her famous throughout the galaxy. Lisa's plan violated every principle of modern warfare and ignored centuries of military advancement. It was also, the Admiral realized with growing interest, likely to work. The approach is extremely dangerous, Admiral Velasquez observed. Failure probability is high, and there are no backup options if the initial assault fails. Yes, ma'am, Lisa replied. But if we succeed, the entire operation will be completed before the terrorists can implement any of their contingency plans or threaten the civilian population. Zexville leaned forward in his chair with his mandibles clicking rapidly. Admiral, this proposal represents exactly the kind of primitive thinking that makes Deathworld species unsuitable for modern military operations. Martinez is suggesting a suicide attack that prioritizes violence over intelligent problem-solving. Lisa turned to face her instructor directly. Sir, with respect, your intelligent problem-solving works fine when everyone agrees to play by the same rules. But these terrorists are not going to follow galactic combat conventions any more than the bioweapon creatures I fought on. Earth followed the laws of physics when they tried to kill me. The Admiral stood up slowly and walked to the edge of the observation platform where she could look down at Lisa more directly. Proceed with the exercise. All teams deploy simultaneously. The competitors moved quickly to their assigned staging areas where various types of ships and equipment waited for the simulated assault on the terrorist-held asteroid. Lisa and Jake made their way to the modified shuttle that had become their weapon as much as their transportation. Jake strapped himself into the co-pilot seat while Lisa ran through the pre-flight checklist one final time. Every non-essential system had been removed to reduce mass and improve acceleration. What remained was barely enough to keep them alive during the mission. You realize we are probably about to die horribly in front of the most important military leader in the galaxy, Jake said as he checked his combat armor seals. Probably, Lisa agreed as she brought the shuttle's engines online. But if we succeed, we are going to change how every species in this galaxy thinks about human military capabilities. Through the shuttle's small windows, they could see other teams beginning their careful approaches to the simulated asteroid. The Veltar Alliance moved in perfect formation with overlapping sensor sweeps and coordinated communication protocols. The energy creatures deployed sophisticated reconnaissance drones that could analyze the target from multiple dimensions. Simultaneously, Lisa engaged the shuttle's acceleration system and felt the familiar pressure of high G-forces pressing her back into her seat. The asteroid grew larger on their navigation display as they approached at a speed that would have terrified any rational pilot, the terrorist. AI responded exactly as Lisa had predicted, launching defensive drones and preparing to repel a boarding action at the main docking facilities. Their weapon systems tracked the incoming shuttle, but did not immediately open fire because no sane attacker would actually attempt a direct collision. Lisa made final course corrections to aim at the structural weak point she had identified in the asteroid's outer hull. The impact would tear through 3 decks and create explosive decompression that would force the defenders to deal with environmental emergencies instead of coordinated resistance. Impact in 30 seconds, she announced to Jake over there. Communication system. Lisa, Jake said quietly, if we survive this, remind me to never doubt your tactical planning again. Lisa smiled grimly as the asteroid filled their entire field of view. If we survive this, Jake, the galaxy is going to learn what happens when you underestimate humans. The shuttle struck the asteroid's hull with the force of a guided missile. Metal screamed and atmosphere vented into space as Lisa and Jake's improvised weapon tore through layers of structure that had never been designed to withstand such an assault. Emergency alarms echoed through the asteroid's corridors as the terrorist AI scrambled to respond to an attack that its programming had never anticipated. Lisa and Jake emerged from the wreckage of their shuttle in full combat armor, moving with the deadly coordination of Marines who had fought together against enemies that gave no quarter and expected none. The real battle was just beginning. Lisa pulled herself out of the twisted wreckage of their shuttle and immediately assessed the situation around her. The impact had torn through 3 decks of the asteroid as planned, creating a path of destruction that led directly toward the facility's command center. Emergency lighting cast red shadows through corridors filled with debris and venting atmosphere. Jake emerged from the crash site beside her, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to fight in confined spaces where hesitation meant death. Their combat armor had protected them from the worst of the impact, but Lisa could feel bruises forming across her ribs and shoulders. The pain was familiar and almost comforting after weeks of sanitized training exercises. The terrorist AI responded exactly as Lisa had predicted. Alarms echoed through the facility as automated systems tried to seal hull breaches and restore atmospheric pressure. The defending forces had prepared for careful infiltration attempts and coordinated assaults, not for someone to literally crash through their defenses like a meteor. Lisa activated her motion sensors and immediately detected 12 targets moving toward their position from different directions. The simulated mercenaries were responding with textbook tactics, establishing defensive positions and attempting to coordinate their counterattack through internal communication systems. They are treating this like a normal boarding action, Lisa said to Jake over their helmet communication system. They expect us to seek cover and try to establish a foothold. Jake checked his weapon systems and confirmed that their improvised equipment had survived the crash. What do we do instead? Lisa studied the tactical display that showed enemy positions throughout the facility. The mercenaries were setting up crossfire zones and preparing to pin down what they assumed would be a conventional assault force. Their programming was sophisticated enough to adapt to changing conditions, but it was still based on civilized warfare principles. We do what no rational species would do, Lisa said as she moved toward the nearest corridor. We attack everything at once. What followed was less a firefight than a storm. Lisa moved through the asteroid's corridors like a force of nature, using the confined spaces and artificial gravity to her advantage in ways that the facility's designers had never anticipated. Where the eye expected her to seek cover and engage at range, she closed distance aggressively, turning every obstacle into a weapon and every tactical disadvantage into an opportunity. The first mercenary unit she encountered was positioned to defend a critical junction using standard overlapping fields of fire. Lisa approached from an access tunnel that the defenders had dismissed as too small for an assault force. She emerged directly behind their position and eliminated 2 targets before they realized they were under attack from an impossible direction. Jake provided covering fire and tactical support, but it quickly became clear that Lisa was operating on a level that the simulation's programmers had never anticipated. She moved through the facility like someone who understood that in real combat, the environment itself was as much a weapon as anything she carried. In the Academy's observation center, Admiral Velasquez watched the tactical display with growing amazement. The other teams were still implementing their careful approaches while Lisa's assault had already reached the facility's intersections. Her movements were economical, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. Exercise completion time, 12 minutes, 17 seconds. Announced the Academy's computer system as Lisa deactivated the final terrorist stronghold and secured the asteroid's command center. Zexthal stared at the tactical recordings in disbelief. His carefully constructed understanding of modern warfare crumbled as he processed what he had witnessed. The sophisticated plans of other teams had become irrelevant because the scenario was over before they could implement their strategies. This should not have worked, he said quietly, his mandibles clicking in rapid distress patterns. The probability calculations indicated certain failure. Admiral Velasquez studied the recorded footage of Lisa's performance throughout the exercise. The human had demonstrated capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare. In the Galactic Age, her speed, adaptability, and willingness to accept personal risk represented a tactical paradigm that advanced species had abandoned as primitive. Instructor Vorthek, the Admiral said carefully, I believe you may need to revise your assessment of human military potential. The recording showed Lisa in the facility's final corridor, facing 3 augmented mercenary units simultaneously. Standard doctrine suggested this was an impossible situation requiring retreat or surrender. Instead, Lisa had used the corridor's emergency systems, artificial gravity generators, and her own physical capabilities to turn the confined space into a trap for her enemies. She fought like an animal, Zexthal protested, using the environment, ignoring personal safety, treating combat like survival rather than a tactical exercise. Which from her perspective it was, Admiral Velasquez replied. Your species has not faced a true survival threat in over 2,000 years, Instructor. Neither have most others in the galaxy. We have forgotten what warfare looks like when failure means extinction rather than economic disadvantage. The Admiral requested Lisa's complete military record from Earth's colonial administration. Her service in the Australian quarantine zone painted a picture of a soldier who had faced genuine existential threats. The bioengineered creatures she had fought possessed capabilities that would terrify most galactic species: rapid adaptation, immunity to conventional weapons, and predatory intelligence focused solely on killing. Admiral Velasquez turned to address the assembled students and instructors. What we have witnessed today represents a fundamental shift in our understanding of human military capabilities. This exercise was not won through superior technology or advanced tactics. It was won through qualities that most of us had forgotten were relevant to modern warfare. Lisa and Jake returned to the observation center still wearing their battered combat armor. Lisa's movements showed the controlled exhaustion of someone who had pushed their physical capabilities to the limit, but her eyes were alert and focused as she stood before the galaxy's most respected military leader. Recruit Martinez, Admiral Velasquez said formally, explain your tactical philosophy. Lisa considered the question carefully before answering. Ma'am, most species in the galaxy have evolved beyond the need for direct physical conflict. Your wars are fought through economics, technology, and negotiation because you have the luxury of treating warfare as a civilized endeavor. She gestured toward the tactical display still showing the completed exercise. Humans come from a world where everything wants to kill us. We learn to fight not because we enjoy violence, but because our survival depended on our ability to end threats quickly and decisively. Admiral Velasquez nodded slowly. And when sophisticated approaches fail? Then you need someone who remembers what it means to fight for survival, Lisa replied. Someone who views tactical disadvantages as problems to solve rather than reasons to surrender. 3 days later, Lisa stood in the Academy's graduation ceremony wearing the highest honors uniform that the institution could award. Admiral Velasquez personally pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on her chest while representatives from dozens of species watched with new understanding of what humans represented in galactic civilization. The ceremony was broadcast throughout known space, and the implications rippled through military commands and government centers on thousands of worlds. Earth's integration into galactic society had taken an unexpected turn. Humans would not just be junior members learning from their technological superiors. They would be teachers themselves, sharing lessons learned in the crucible of a world that demanded strength to survive. CEX Thule approached Lisa after the ceremony ended. His posture showed the respect that his species reserved for proven warriors rather than the condescension she had endured for weeks. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. I assessed your species based on our standards, our limitations, our fears. I failed to understand that what we view as primitive might actually represent evolution in a different direction. Lisa accepted his apology with the grace that came from having proven her point beyond any doubt. Sir, I think we can learn from each other. Your tactical theories work well for large-scale operations and political warfare. But when everything goes wrong and sophisticated plans fail, you might want someone like me around. Zexl's mandibles clicked in what Lisa now recognized as genuine respect. Indeed, I believe the galaxy is about to discover that Deathworld primitives might be exactly what we need. As Lisa looked out at her future among the stars, she knew that humans had found their place in galactic civilization not despite being from a Deathworld, but because of it. The universe was vast and dangerous, filled with threats that could not be negotiated with or overwhelmed through technology alone. Sometimes it needed warriors who remembered what it meant to fight for survival. The galaxy was about to learn that underestimating humans was a mistake you only made once.